Now we're in. All right, all right, all right. All right, good evening. It's so good to see you all. Thank you for your patience as I scrambled to make sure we have everything. Margaret was in the office this afternoon and she goes, "Do you need help with anything?" I said, "Do you have a PhD in pre-Diluvian antiquity?" And she said no. And I said, "Yeah, nor do I. And I certainly feel it." So the topic this evening, or the content, is going to be Genesis chapter 6 through Genesis chapter 11. And silly me, right? I thought it was going to be just, easy, you know? And maybe as we get in, we will say it's easy. But I think as we discover some things about it, we'll have our hands full.
Well, does it take us through the whole thing, like afterwards?
It does. It takes us all the way to the Tower of Babel.
Well, there's some confusion in there.
A little confusion. There's confusion tonight.
Especially the tower.
That's right. So if you're watching online, that's where we're headed. And if you're here, I wanted to go through the handouts and then some resources. We'll talk about it. We'll do a review, recap. We'll hop in a little bit. We'll talk about an outline for the chapters. We might read some of the stories if the group is unfamiliar with some of it, then that'll force us to read some of it. But if we can do broad strokes on some of it, that'll help. Obviously, we're not going to read verbatim chapters 6 through 11, and that'll be the first time in Bible study that we've not done that. So this will be interesting. I'm sure we'll see how we do. You feel left out? I don't want you to feel left out. So before we get started, shall we pause for a word of prayer this evening? Holy God, as we gather into this space, we know that you already are here, and so we pray that we would be aware of your presence. May your Spirit come and guide our conversation. Help us to understand the words. Help us to understand the themes. Help us to understand you at work. Help us to understand the human story. And help us to understand all the stuff that is just over our heads and the fiddly bits and the difficult words to say. And so we love you very much and pray this all in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, so a few things on the handouts. One is that this pre-patriarchal period. So when we look at Genesis, it's normally divided into a couple sections, right? You have like the creation narrative. That'd be like Genesis 1, 2. Sometimes Genesis 3 is included in there. Sometimes people will call that the fall, although the word the fall is not in Genesis chapter 3, just saying. So sometimes people talk about that. And then, you got Cain and Abel's story, and then you have some genealogy that we encountered, come maybe from two different sources. And then from there, it goes to the this kind of flood account. And then after the flood, it goes to Babel. And then after Babel, it kind of goes into Abraham from there. As soon as you hit Abraham, I think Genesis sort of hits its stride. It starts going. And that's called the patriarchs because it focuses on this covenant with this guy and his family. We're not there yet. That's Abraham, but that's chapters 12 all the way to the end. So that's the rest of the story. It'll kind of go all the way through. So if you look at pre-patriarchal period, they're talking about everything before Abraham. So that'd be kind of chapters 1 through 11. There are some other words up here about Syria, Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is an area. Canaan is an area. And Egypt, of course, we know it as, where the pyramids are and the Sphinx. It's a kingdom. It's also an area. The Nile Valley is an ancient area. So that's this. There's some good information in here. In particular, I wanted to draw your attention to the second page on this, which is the Table of Nations. The Table of Nations is sort of shorthand for Genesis chapter 10, who are sort of all the descendants of Noah. And they, lots of kids, and they all sort of spread out with different spaces, and they have different descendants and people. And so we'll look at a map later, and there's some clarity about where they are and who they represent. And then there's some ones that people end up kind of shrugging their shoulders and they go, I don't know, it's really old. I feel that. So that's that. I hope that's helpful for you. And that's, I think, a pretty helpful resource. The other two handouts, I realized today that my professional library is lacking on demonology and Lucifer. So silly me, right? I should remedy that problem. So some of these articles are, I will admit, fairly old for sort of scholarly resources. I did not go into journal articles and all that jazz because I didn't want to bore us. I know some of you would gobble that stuff up and just love it. But I feel like 80% of people are just like, oh, JSTOR and Atla. Oh, please no. See, exactly. So 20% of you know what I'm talking about, and 80% of you are like, I know, please don't. So these are some accessible dictionary articles. One is from 86 and one is from 96. And they're the kind of the best condensed things I could find on Satan and Lucifer. We had this discussion about a passage out of Ezekiel, the deceiver, and is that Lucifer? Is this the serpent? I handed out an article last week on the serpent, and all that. This is to piggyback on that. I'm still trying to find an article on sin and death and this connection between the theology of sin and how it leads to death and what kind of death. I'm working on it. I've not forgotten. I just, I have to find something that's like, here, this is accessible, as opposed to, here, read this 300-page book. So I'm working on it, just to say. So that's these two things. I hope these are helpful. And then I wrote the names of the dictionary on the photocopies. So if you were that person that wanted to, dig deeper, there you go. Those are my resources. I hope those are helpful. Any questions? Doing okay? One more thing. Oh goodness, those are my keys. One more thing I forgot is I just wanted to say that if you wanted to come up afterwards and take a look, I have these wonderful little atlases that I just think are very incredibly helpful. And so when you try and figure out, like that first handout is from this book right here by Rasmussen, Atlas of the Bible. It's by Zondervan, which is a good middle of the road. It's not crazy liberal and it's not crazy conservative, right? This is just straight up meat and potatoes Christianity. Really good stuff. And then this is IVP Atlas of Bible History. There's really beautiful pictures, great maps, because we're going to get into some places, right, where you're like, mountains of error at? Where are the mountains of error at? Yeah, exactly, right? It's where the ark landed, yeah. And so, like, did it land on a mountain called Ararat, or did it land on the mountains in the region of Ararat? And it turns out the answer is yes, right? And what's even more, I think, beautiful about that story is we know where that is. It's not like it's some made-up mythological place. It's in Turkey. And so it's just fascinating, right? I think it's interesting. And since I'm an American, I don't know where Turkey is. I'm kidding, right? Yeah, right? So, it's helpful to point to some of these places. Like the Dead Sea has been there for a long time. The Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, right? The Arabian Sea. All these places, you can point to them and say, these are the stories. Abraham's going to come out of Ur. Well, we know where that is. You can point to it on the map and say, this is his hometown. And he goes up the river. Like, you can follow his journey. Okay, just interesting. I had this wonderful professor in undergrad when you would read stories in the Bible about, like, King David, and it said that he had to go through a particular valley. Right? It's easy to read that story and go, oh, it's amazing. God is in the middle of that, and he is navigating David's life. And yes, that is true. But maybe the reason David had to go through that valley is because that was the only way to get through the mountains. And so when you see it on a map, right, when these places come alive, all of a sudden these stories make, I don't want to say they make sense, but they come alive. You go, oh yeah, of course David had to go through that valley. That's the only way to get from point A to point B, right? And so it's easy to read it and kind of mythologize God into the story. It's also interesting to read it and see the context and the cultural background and say, oh, I see God in the middle of the story. And so I think you can get to both sides as opposed to looking at it from just God or just the earth, right? Does that make sense? Kind of coming from both ways? All right. I've now stalled enough. I'm just kidding. All right. So we have a big chunk to get through, Genesis 6 through 11. I do have a video that we're going to try and watch tonight. It's about 7 minutes long. And it's from that same group that we heard from in week 1, where in week 1 we saw an overview of the book of Genesis as a whole. We'll look at just Genesis, I think, 1 through 11. and I'll talk about them a little bit before we do the video. So here's where we've been. We've been looking at Genesis 1 through 11. We're going to finish that off tonight. This is week 5. We've been through week 1 of creation, week 2 of creation, week 3 of sin, week 4 kind of early accounts of humanity. And we wrestled through some of those things, and we are all experts now on the descendants of Cain and Abel. Taking a look at some major themes so we don't forget what we're encountering. We've talked about God as creator. God is creative individual, is entity, is the origin of life. God is engaged with creation. God is not off distant somewhere else. God is not the watchmaker who set it and forgot it. God is involved. We've seen God as relational. God seems to be relational both with God's creation, right? God is walking in the garden, talking with them. And then God is also in a relationship with God's self. Genesis 1 through 3, we've talked about how you can view it a couple different ways. You can view it as archetypal. You can view it as descriptive. You can view it as an existential posture. Genesis 4 and 5, this is my addition to the slide, right, this week. We've seen sort of the shattering of sin's effect on the world and relationships. So sin enters the picture and it all goes to pot. And then early accounts of the first humans and the first family / families. There's a lot of different people named and genealogy, and we've seen kind of the early accounts. That's right. Those women are there, and Lamech's wives are named, and that's about it. All right, Genesis 6 through 11, at a glance. So I've taken a couple commentaries, in particular Victor Hamilton. If you're the note taker, you like reading his stuff, he's very helpful to read. His name's Victor Hamilton again. I've taken some of his stuff, and I disagreed with him on some of these, so I changed them. This is my take on it. But for the most part, right, we got 6 chapters, Genesis 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Divided into 2 columns just for nice and easy taking a look at. Genesis 6, there is a fascinating little passage there, verses 1 through 4, about the sons of God and the daughters of humankind. This is the story about the Nephilim and the giants and the warriors of renown. If you've never heard the story, you can read it while I keep talking. If you're going to ask me questions about it, I'm going to go, oh, yeah, we can talk about it if you like. Genesis 6, 5 through 12, God talks about the reasons for a flood. And then there's a command to build an ark. Just short show of hands. There is no shame. I just kind of want to know, maybe need to know as someone leading this. How many have heard the crazy story about the Nephilim before? Okay, 2 of us maybe. 3, great. Vera, it's okay, good. How many have heard the story about the flood before? Yes, good. Okay, we're doing good. Okay. And so you know about the flood, right? And you know that Noah was the guy that is commanded to build an ark. And it's in Kentucky. Okay. And then Genesis 7, right, is the command to enter the ark. And then the flood sort of starts. And in the story, right, Noah takes the animals 2 by 2, right? And they enter the flood. They all come together. It's very good. And then the flood starts. The waters kind of rise up. And you've seen the movie with Russell Crowe, and everyone drowns. It's fine, right? And then the flood sort of crests, covers all the mountaintop, all the dry land. And then the flood waters recede. Very interesting, some details in the scripture about how the waters, what does the Bible read? It says basically like the rivers are corked up, or the water's drawn back into the earth like a sponge. It's just some fascinating poetry and beautiful language. And then the dry land emerges. And then Noah leaves the ark. All right, so we will remember together with great clarity, Noah does not stay on the ark. Right, then the ark comes to rest on top of a mountain. Noah and his family get out. And then God covenants with Noah. God puts a rainbow in the sky and promises to never flood the earth again. So all this rain, don't worry, it's cool, it's fine, we'll be all right. and then after that, Noah becomes the first. He gets involved with viticulture. What's the word? Someone who works at vineyard. Help me. Vineyard. No, it's got a name, right? You know, like a vintner, maybe that might be it, right? Well, we're playing Scrabble now. This is good. Okay, I think you're right. Yeah. It's something like that. Somalia, you're right, yeah. So Noah plants a vineyard. He likes wine, and he gets sort of drunk, and you would too if you spent that long in an ark with your family. That's the joke. And then there's some interesting story about Noah's nakedness. And his son might cover his nakedness or enters the tent and his father's naked. It doesn't go very well. There's some bad stuff that happens. And then we go on and we move on with our lives. We come to chapter 10. It's the Table of Nations. It's boom, 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 boom. A lot of different names, right? Then Genesis 11, a very interesting story about the Tower of Babel. They sort of begin to build this big tower together. God confuses them or their language, and there's some discussion that God has about, them becoming high and mighty. And then there's the genealogy of the Shemites at the very end. And that is the end of chapter 11. So out of all of those, just curious, I see some of y'all reading and taking a look. What is new to you, or what have you never heard before? What is something that jumps off this kind of slide at you, or things that you had not heard of? Yeah.
There were two things as I was reading this. That sons of God and daughters of, one of my Bible says mankind, one says mankind. I just don't remember ever noticing that before. And then and Noah's nakedness.
Yes.
I want to talk about those two stories.
It's always funny to me. I grew up in the era, so I was born in 85. I know I'm a young person, but I was born in 85, and I remember they would do the flannel graphs, right? You know what I'm talking about? The blue flannel graphs, and they put up the flannel pictures of Noah, and they never had a picture of naked Noah. So, I just think they robbed me of the gem in the story, It's wild how it's a children's story. What else? What else was interesting to you or new to you or something that you had not heard of before? Or as I'm saying it, you're like, I didn't know that was in the Bible. That happens frequently. Just keep.
In chapter 6, the Lord said that he would not contend with men forever and be mortal, so his day would be numbered to 120. And then all these people lived 400, 200, and 600 dollars
Yes.
after that.
Yep.
He didn't very well with that, did he?
Yeah. Yeah. There's some fascinating discussion about what does that mean and what's the significance of that. And
Well, they had created enough people in that 400 years that they could cut down the gym.
just wean them down a bit. Yeah.
Lifespan wasn't 900 years, it was only.
That didn't
100
need to
years.
be.
They wouldn't have as many children.
Yeah. Good. What else? Anything else? Good? All right.
Oh, I know.
Yes.
He said, well, God tells him to gather up all these various animals. But when the animals actually board, they do it on their own. They come to Noah.
That's fair.
I mean, I can't remember exactly how it's written.
Yeah. And you can tell with this we're going to be so let's look at a few. Let's just before we get to the flood, I'll leave that up there because it's a pretty picture. Let's just read a little bit of Genesis 6, and we'll jump around a little bit, some sections, and we'll sit together with these texts. So this is Genesis 6, 1 through 4. When people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went in to the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. It's a fascinating little tidbit. So, I do not have a PhD in...
That's what gave us Al Skelly.
But what do you think this little story is? What do you think it is? What do you think it is? Why is it here? What is its function, its purpose? Is it true? Is it hocus pocus? Is it made up? Why is it in your Bible? Should we cross it out?
I think the guy who wrote it must have been intrigued by the fact that there was a group of really tall people suddenly.
Okay, right? So I don't know if you all heard what she said, but maybe the person who wrote it was intrigued that there was a group of certain people, either very tall people, very strong people, or a group of people. So we could say that this text exists to tell us where they came from or to put meaning to why they're there. What else do you think?
So the men were Nephilims, they were called Nephilim, or they were from Nephilim?
It's a good question.
Because it says the Nephilim.
So that's a group of people.
It's a designation, right?
And
There are some people that would say this is an account of the angels. And the reason, and again, I'm not hemming and hawing. There is no one singular meaning behind this. Are we tracking with some of that? I think we discovered this last week with Cain and Abel a little bit, right? I think there are probably 4 or 5 different groups or camps of reading in this passage in particular. So some people will say this is the origin of angels, and that's how they read it. Okay, that's fine. Genesis 6, 1 through 4. You don't have 6, 1 through 4?
I got 1 through 4, but I don't have the anything about that.
He's got the King James Version.
They don't mention it.
Oh, go ahead and read it for us. I'll get close so everyone online can hear you in the mic.
Oh, okay. It says, "It came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them as wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in these days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, and same became mighty men, which were of old men of renown. And God saw," and there's nothing about whatever that,
Nephilim.
Nephilim, nothing about that.
Oh, okay.
King James doesn't say that.
It said giants.
Nephilim means giant.
Well, so again, I'm going to ask you that question, right? And this is the whole, right? We've had this discussion over and over again with other names and words in the Bible. So, does Nephilim mean giant men? Right? Does Adam mean Adam, or does it mean humanity, or does it mean man? And the answer, right, is maybe yes, or context, or it depends how it's used.
There's always been groups of people who were super taller than other people. And we went down through one of the museums in southern Indiana, and there was a whole group of people who came to join the army. Was it Civil War, Janet? Do you remember?
Civil War, yes.
And-
We're all from Monroe County.
And
They're real tall.
And they were giants.
Nephilim.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so let's keep playing with this, right? With this, I think this is a difficult passage, and I don't think there's. I'll be honest. I don't think there's any great moral teaching out of it. So I'm not going to say, oh, this has deep, powerful meaning for my life, and I am transformed because of it. So if it does not have deep, powerful moral meaning behind it, and I'm not transformed because of it, what is its function in our holy text? Because it's part of our Bible, right? So we should be able to approach it with a certain humility and a certain reverence in a way that it still speaks to us. So how can we understand it? If it doesn't serve to morally guide and teach us, what is its function? Other than to confuse us.
Okay, if these men were mighty men and men of renown, and right after that God says, they're all wicked.
Uh-huh.
They were men of renown, but they weren't men of renown. They were not good people. They might have been giants or big or whatever they were, but they weren't good folks.
Yeah.
Because right after that he said, he saw the wickedness of man.
Great. Wonderful, right? So let's look at its placement in the text. Like we talked about Genesis 5 last week, and why is that there? Well, to get us to Noah, right? It's building up. There's 10 generations from, Adam and Eve, or Cain and I forget, I have to go back and look, all the way up to Noah. And that's one of the functions of it being there. Like this little tidbit about Nephilim and angels or giants or men of renown, it could be put lots of places. Or maybe it serves a function in the text to get us to where the story is going. And so it could lead to descriptions of the wickedness, and therefore God needs to remedy the situation, and he's going to remedy it by water.
So my,
We'll come back. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Or
okay,
I will. The sons of God, where did they come from?
I don't know. Are you asking? Do you know?
At one point, the sons of God were immortal. They married like the sweet young human females. Now, the prodigy is not immortal. They only live so long.
That's right. Yep.
That could theoretically be the start of sin.
I see what you're saying. It could be this sort of mixture, and that because it's because they're not God, right? You're saying it could be the start of sin.
No, sin was already gone.
Well, the word sin was mentioned earlier, but again, go ahead. I think you had something to say about you had a study Bible or
yeah,
some
I
thoughts.
have a Wesley study Bible, and it says there are several options for the meaning. One is that the marriage is between a faithful Sethite and wicked Canaanite. The second option is polygamous marriages of dynastic rulers, and the third is a literal rendering among demonic and angelic nation.
It's beautiful. Okay.
I like all of those.
Yeah. All right. Good. I'm not going to give you an answer unless you haven't figured that out yet. I just, because I don't really have one. I also don't think it's my function as your pastor to say this is the answer, because I'm not too sure there is one particular. The church has not said this is the answer on this passage.
We haven't gotten to the place yet where God told the Jews not to intermarry, have we?
No, we haven't. And that's what's so interesting about a reading of that. And we saw this last week as well with Cain and Abel, where Cain and Abel are making a sacrifice.
Yeah.
Well, God didn't say anything about sacrifice yet.
No,
And so,
in the chapter.
not for a few more chapters. And so what's happening is some of the sacrificial law is being, I'll say, read back into the context of these chapters, right? It's as if the authors of these old stories are saying, well, of course they made sacrifice and offering. We haven't gotten there yet, but of course they did that. Just wait a few more books of the Bible, and then we'll get there.
Somewhere in the first 5 chapters, it said, and people started recognizing God at that time. But it was after, that's written after.
Yeah.
Cain and Abel.
In verse 4, chapter 4, last verse, it says, at that time people began to invoke the name of the Lord. What does it mean, Basil? I don't know. Okay, we're doing okay so far? Yep.
Is the Bible written chronologically?
Chronologically?
No.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I would say yes and no, right? The technical answer is not the way that we think of chronologically written, Like even Paul's letters are arranged not by when he wrote them, but they are arranged by length. And so Romans is the first Pauline epistle that we run into, and it's his magnum opus, right? It's his big work. It's 16 chapters, but it's not his first letter. And Paul wrote other things first. And the whole entire, how in the world do we date these things, is a fantastic question that we're also asking, right? How do we know when Genesis was written? I mean, the short answer is we don't know. But the longer answer is it's complicated, right? And the truth, like all things, is complicated. So let's talk about dating, not relationships, but let's talk about dating in terms of finding a date for certain books of the Bible. How would we date Genesis? Or how would you date any book of the Bible? What do you look for?
Well, you look for historical things that have happened.
Let's give a good example.
Well, I'm not great, but apparently there really was a star that the
Yes, that the wise men followed.
And that star really was. So that's one way of dating.
Yeah. When there's, go ahead. Yes? Ideas?
So there's archaeology
Oh.
now.
Okay, so what do we mean by that? Because this will get into Noah a little bit, and
Okay, well, going back to Adam and Eve, they have all these people that they list, and they tell you
yes,
who came after.
Yeah.
Okay, now how long did those people live? And they tell you
they do.
they live 700, 800,
Yep.
900, whatever. So if you go back and take all these people, add however long they live, we ought to be able to tell the timetable.
Yeah, you could. You know, and if sorry.
Prove that though. Like,
Right. No, you're exactly right. Yeah.
I could say that my parents are 100 years old.
Yep.
And it's just because they're old.
Yep. You're right.
They're 100 years old.
So how do you do it? Like, do you take the timetable in the genealogy and say that is the duration of the time, or again, we talked about this last week too? Is that the function of the genealogy? Is the function of the genealogy in Genesis to give you the dates?
But it's about the story. I mean, the
Yes.
story is what the Jewish people believed and told and talked about. And so they came up with these numbers from wherever they came up to tell the story of how this all happened. And I think, I may have tried to calculate, if you calculate this from all this information, I mean, the earth is supposedly 5,700 years old.
Yeah, it's like 6,000 something.
6,000.
Yeah.
So if you take all those numbers, but okay, why did they do it that way? Because it had to be part of the story. It was part of the story to explain how the Jewish people came to be, how we came to be. So there had to be a reason for them to do it that way.
Okay. So let's keep playing with this idea of dating and the story and numbers. I think there's significance here. I really do. I think that in this case, I think you can have your cake and eat it too. I really believe that. So how long was Noah on the boat for? A year?
I forget.
601.
Okay.
Well, that's one way of looking at
How long did it rain for?
it. 40 days.
Okay.
But it had to be so muddy after that, it took a while to get them out.
I would say so.
It rained all day
I would say
Wednesday
so.
and Thursday.
And let's go back to what we talked about last week. How many generations were there between Adam and Noah? Well, the technical answer is it depends, right? It depends on which genealogy you
They
read.
didn't have depends.
You could say it's 10. Am I frustrating you yet? What's the point of numbers in the Bible?
Just tell the story.
To tell the story, sometimes to show meaning in the story. So the dates for these people, I think you're right, is to tell the story. I don't think they're necessarily trying to prove the timeline of antiquity. So sometimes the numbers are there to help us remember the story, to tell the story. But how do we go on about dating Genesis and figuring out what happened when? We've already talked about some things. So when they mention Babel,
Don't they also know that there was a mighty flood?
yes, maybe, yes.
And can't they dig stuff by that?
Yeah, so when we look at Noah and you look at the flood, there are other accounts of flood in antiquity. And when I say antiquity, I mean somewhere back there, old accounts. So for example, the Babylonians have an account called the Gilgamesh Epic. And the Gilgamesh Epic is a story about a guy on a boat who is saved during a flood. Now, the whole entire thing sounds like Noah until it doesn't, because the God is very different in the story. And the animals, it's just all very different, but it's all very similar. Does that make sense? And so you can say, why do these two separate accounts of a flood exist? Maybe there really was a flood, right? And, go ahead. Yes.
Because the 300 feet is, everything lives on there. And it goes down about 1,000 feet. The rest, there was supposedly a glacier that blocked the Mediterranean to them. And then it dissolved, and you got seawater, the bottom 3/4 is seawater, salted water.
Yeah.
And it's totally sterile. They got ships down there, 3,000-4,000 years of age, perfect condition.
So in the geological record and in the archaeological record, there exists tons of evidence of a flood in this area. And so you're left with a few interpretations of the flood. Either the flood is a true worldwide flood. That means, all the tippy tops of a very tall mountain was underwater. Nod your head, you're with me. That's what the Bible says, right? Even though the Bible doesn't say anything because it's a book, but that's what we read in the Bible, right? And so that is, if we believe that to be true, then that's one, that is a conclusion we can draw from the Noah text. Another conclusion you can draw from the Noah text is that it was a regional flood. And it was so bad that it covered every mountaintop in the region. And if your known world is that region, that's the world.
That's as far as you could see, or as far as you could.
As far as you've been, as far as anyone's been. Right? Christopher Columbus had not sailed the ocean blue. So there'd be dragons over there. There is no North America and South America. You could say it was a regional flood, and it was so vast and large that the account is true. But maybe it didn't cover the entire world the way that we think of the world. You could read it that way as well, and I think, are you ready? I think the Bible's still true when you read it that way. How is the story false if it's a regional flood? It's not. Because the whole world's covered. Sorry?
Your world.
Noah's world.
But don't a lot of societies, cultures, have stories like this?
They do. Absolutely.
Many societies apparently have very similar stories to the Noah story.
Okay. Yes, they do. Right? They come from a lot of different societies. And it's not just flood stories. If we talk about this, earthquakes, what else? Like you have eclipses, you have the birth of humans, sometimes through like God's killed. I'm getting to my point, I promise. Right? What is the function and purpose of the Noah story? If we talked about it.
Start the story over.
Okay, to start the story over. Who's the main actor in the Noah story?
Noah.
God. Right? And what's Noah's role in the Noah story?
Obedience.
Okay, obedience. What else? Yes, right? He gives instructions. He can follow them or he cannot. Does this sound familiar? He chooses to follow them. And because of his obedience, he's able to save his family. Right? How does God floods the earth, whether it's a regional flood or a worldwide flood, I don't think it matters. You read it however you want to read it. Right? Noah is delivered. How is Noah delivered?
Off the ark.
Right? He's delivered on an ark through the water. Fast forward, Moses is going to take all of God's people out of Egypt, out of slavery. He's going to take them to a big sea. And how does God deliver God's people? Through the water. God sees them safely through the water. Fast forward, Moses sends Joshua into the land between to go see if they can take it. They come back. Caleb and Joshua say, this land is filled with what? Giants. There's no way. We can't do it. And then they need to cross What body of water? The river
Jordan.
Jordan. So God delivers them through the waters of the Jordan into the promised land. Fast forward, Jesus goes out into the wilderness to find John the Baptist, and he's baptized in the water. Fast forward, right? The church baptizes you in water, and you're delivered from sin and death into new life. So the symbolism of water in antiquity is what?
Great.
Sorry? You said great? It is great, yeah.
I mean, large.
Yes, yeah, it's all over the place. But what's the function of water in our Noah story? Renewal. A renewal of sin, right? It cleanses the earth. It's also a sign of God's judgment in this story. It doesn't last long. People go back to their own tricks. Okay, but do you hear how the story of Noah is archetypal for so many other things in the Bible?
I like
Yeah.
that choice of words.
Archetypal.
You didn't mean to say it.
No, I didn't. You're right.
That's what
That's
we
what y'all
were.
heard, but it is. It tells the story. And I forgot one too. Moses is put in a basket and put on the waters. Like this story happens over and over and over again. So don't miss it. The story of Noah is not about animals, right? But it's about animals. But it's not. It's about God's care and deliverance.
And like he created the first animals, now he's saved.
He saves them. I see some doubts. Some questions. Go ahead.
Okay, because Noah, okay, Adam and Eve were the start of all this. Well, Noah comes along. All of us are related to Noah.
Yes.
If Noah was the guy that was on the ark with his family, then all of us come from that family.
Right.
I don't know, that's a little strange.
Well,
The tree gets a little straight there, right?
So that's the way Adam
I
and
think
Eve were
we're
actually
from
Noah.
Nephilim.
And, you know, these people, when Adam and Eve, you know, did what they did, Cain and Abel, all this stuff, and these people all come on the earth, and they're bad. They're bad. And so God says, we gotta get rid of these.
Naughty, naughty.
Screwed
Yep.
up. I messed up. So he decides to kill everybody off because he's met, like,
It says it pains God's heart.
yeah.
He feels pain in his heart.
And so then he brings Noah along, and then all of us come from Noah, which seems
Do you have a hard time believing this story?
a little bit.
Okay.
All of us then are from Noah's family. I don't, I just, something doesn't add up quite right. I mean, the story makes sense in a way, but for all of us to be descended from Noah and his family, I'm not sure, I don't understand that. And if the flood was not over all the earth, then they were not the only people on the earth. What about the people in other parts of the world that were not flooded, or maybe they were? So yeah, I have a little trouble with this story.
Yeah. So if you read it as a worldwide flood, absolutely, you would have, I think, even more difficulty, right? If you read it as a regional flood, then you can make room for other allowances of people of different places, cultures, and descendants to be in their locales. And if you don't even read it as a literal story, but about a story that is supposed to teach us literal things, then you can read it differently. Is that really unhelpful, or is it helpful?
Well, and he's still doing, okay, and then he says, they sent the dove out, and it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up. So that was 600 years from what?
No, that's his year. No, that's how, that's Noah's age. His age was 600 when he got on the ark, and
Right.
601 when
And he got
It
off.
was his, oh, it was his age.
that's
Yeah.
Noah's age.
Yeah.
Oh, see, okay,
Yeah, you're in verse 11 of chapter 7, right?
I'm 13.
Yeah, so in the 600 year of Noah's life, in the second month, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. So that's when the flood begins. And you're in verse 17?
I'm in verse 13 of chapter 8.
Yep. in the 601st year, in the first month, on the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from the earth. So yeah, they're tracking that with Noah's lifespan.
That's his age, okay, because I'm thinking, why is that? What is going on with that? Well, that's Noah's life.
Yeah, it would be right, and to make it not Bible-y, to make it more like, you know, when Josh was 40, he got the Corvette. When he was 42, he sold the Corvette. You know, so that's like in this day, this happens for Noah, and then that year, this was when the waters receded.
And before they got on the ark, Noah already had the 3 boys, a wife and 3 boys.
Yeah,
They had wives.
it's that whole song. I won't torture you with the VBS song. Okay. No, I will not. I will not. We're running out of time. All right. So, oh no, look how small that is and so tiny. Okay. So let's just skim in your Bible, if you will, to Genesis chapter 10. It's a very interesting chapter, and I'm just going to just skim parts of it. Sound good? So these are the descendants of Noah's sons. Here we go. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Children were born to them after the flood. The descendants of Japheth, blah, 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 blah. Descendants of Ham, blah, 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 blah. But you notice a couple like Cush, Egypt, Put, Canaan. Okay, we're going to keep going, right? And then to Shem, also the father of all the children of Eber, the elder brother of Japheth. And it goes on, and you get all these places and names. If you're lucky, some of you might have a nice little map in your Bible. Or maybe the pastor photocopied one for you. And you have one now to look at, to give you some context to where some of these places are. So if you go to that second page there, if you're walking online, hopefully you can see this better. But you have places like Cush, which we've talked about before. If you're watching online, I'm probably going to disappear. Cush is often located here. Wow. It's located here in this space. And it's usually thought of as Ethiopia. It is Ethiopia. And then you have other places like Shem, which is over here in the Arabian Peninsula, right? Let's locate ourselves a little bit if you're tracking with me. That big body of water, that's the Mediterranean Sea. That's where you would take cruises. It's beautiful. Great cuisine, right? Greece is here. The big boot up there is Italy. Over here, this is the land between, or Israel. The fascinating thing about Israel that they will teach you in seminary, and that sometimes we forget, is that it touches 3 continents, right? It touches Africa, it touches Asia, and it touches Europe. It's the land bridge between these 3 places. So the amount of travel and places that would have gone between there and cultures is right in the mixing pot of all of that. So that's that area. All of the names that are listed in the table of nations, Genesis chapter 10, we don't know where all of them are. I think that's okay. All right, I don't lose sleep over that. You probably don't either, but I'm just being honest. Some of them we do know where they are. So when it says in verse 6, the descendants of Ham were Cush and Egypt. We know where Egypt is, right? You can locate it on a map. It's a real place. And some other ones that are mentioned there. So hopefully that map is helpful. You'll see some ones that are hard to pronounce, like Tubal. Does that sound familiar? Yeah? It should. Yeah, Tubal-Cain, right, in that area. You'll notice Nineveh and Calah are placed there as well on the Tigris and Euphrates. Those are those rivers over there. So here's the Persian Gulf, and you see these rivers that creep up this way. You notice Babel is right there. It's still unclear to me after all this time if Babel is Babylon, and I think it is. I'm not quite sure exactly how those words get mixed up, but that's okay.
Yeah, that's because
God mixed up the language. So Babel or Babylon is located over here on the rivers. You have another place that's not here on the map, but listed. These rivers become very important because is over here on the rivers as well. And is important because that's the home city of Abraham. And that's Genesis chapter 12. So, I'm going to ask the question again. What is the purpose and function of Genesis 10 in our Bibles? Establishing the setting, telling the story. Who are these characters? Why are they important? Right? You've got to know where they come from if you need to know the story about God and God being in the midst of our story. Doing okay? Okay, I'm going to push on here a little bit. And I'm going to, for the sake of time, I'm going to keep the Tower of Babel right here. I'm going to put up our video. We'll watch it, and then we'll talk about the Tower of Babel a little bit, and then we'll be done. Good? All right. So if you're watching online, give me a second while I go into back of house here. Perfect. I love notifications. Let's do this. Great. Okay. So before we watch this, this is from a wonderful website. It's called The Bible Project. I would encourage you to check it out. It's a bunch of people who are Bible nerds. They love ancient texts. Some of them are pastors. Some of them are ex-pastors, and the fact that they now work for this thing full-time. Not like they, stole all the money and ran or whatever it might be. They just decided this is their passion. So they're nerds. They love the Bible. I think it's great stuff, and it doesn't really preach to you. It just sort of just tells you kind of like what it is. So we'll get into it. So I'll let you watch this, and I think I'll watch with you.
The book of Genesis. It's the first book of the Bible, and its storyline divides into two main parts. There's chapters 1 through 11, which tell the story of God and the whole world. And then there's chapters 12 through 50, which zoom in and tell the story of God and just one man, Abraham, and then his family. And these two parts are connected by a hinge story at the beginning of chapter 12. And this design, it gives us a clue to how to understand the message of the book as a whole and how it introduces the story of the whole Bible. So the book begins with God taking the disorder and the darkness described in the second sentence of the Bible, and God brings out of it order and beauty and goodness. He makes a world where life can flourish. And God makes these creatures called humans, or Adam in Hebrew. He makes them in his image, which has to do with their role and purpose in God's world. So the humans are made to be reflections of God's character out into the world, and they're appointed as God's representatives to rule his world on his behalf, which in context means to harness all of its potential, to care for it, and make it a place where even more life can flourish. God blesses the humans. It's a key word in this book. And he gives them a garden. It's like a place from which they begin starting to build this new world. Now, the key is that the humans have a choice about how they're going to go about building this world. And that's represented by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Up till now, God has provided and defined what is good and what is not good. But now God is giving the humans the dignity and the freedom of a choice. Are they going to trust God's definition of good and evil, or are they going to seize autonomy and define good and evil for themselves? And the stakes are really high. To rebel against God is to embrace death, because you're turning away from the giver of life himself. This is represented by the tree of life. And so in chapter 3, a mysterious figure, a snake, enters into the story. The snake's given no introduction other than it's a creature that God made. And it becomes clear that it's a creature in rebellion against God, and it wants to lead the humans into rebellion and their death. The snake tells a different story about the tree and the choice. It says that seizing the knowledge of good and evil are not going to bring death, that it's actually the way to life and becoming like God themselves. Now, the irony of this is tragic, because we know the humans, they're already like God. They were made to reflect God's image. But instead of trusting God, the humans seize autonomy, they take the knowledge of good and evil for themselves, and in an instant, the whole story spirals out of control. The first casualty is human relationships. The man and the woman, they suddenly realize how vulnerable they are now. They can't even trust each other. And so they make clothes and they hide their bodies from one another. The second casualty is that intimacy between God and the humans is lost. So they go and run and hide from God, and then when God finds them, they start this game of blame shifting about who rebelled first. Now, right here, the story stops, and there's a series of short poems where God declares to the snake and then to the humans the tragic consequences of their actions. God first tells the snake that despite its apparent victory, it is destined for defeat, to eat dust. God promises that one day a seed or a descendant will come from the woman who's going to deliver a lethal strike to the snake's head. Which sounds like great news, but this victory is going to come with a cost, because the snake too will deliver a lethal strike to the descendant's heel as it's being crushed. It's a very mysterious promise of this wounded victor. But in the flow of the story so far, you see this is an act of God's grace. The humans, they've just rebelled, and what does God do? He promises to rescue them. But this doesn't erase the consequences of the humans' decision. So God informs them that now every aspect of their life together, at home and out in the field, it's going to be fraught with grief and pain because of the rebellion, all leading to their death. From here, the story then spirals downward. Chapters 3 through 11, they trace the widening ripple effect of the rebellion and of human relationships fracturing at every level. So there's a story about two brothers, Cain and Abel. Cain's so jealous of his brother that he wants to murder him. And God warns him not to give in to the temptation, but he does anyway. He murders him in the field. So Cain then goes on to build a city where violence and oppression reign. And this is all epitomized in the story of Lamech. He's the first man in the Bible to have more than one wife. He's accumulating them like property. And then he goes on to sing a short song about how he's more violent and vengeful than Cain ever was. After this, we get an odd story about the sons of God, which could refer to evil angelic beings, or it could refer to ancient kings who claimed that they descended from the gods. And like Lamech, they acquire as many wives as they wanted, and they produce the Nephilim, these great warriors of old. Whichever view is right, the point is that humans are building kingdoms that fill God's world with violence and even more corruption. In response, we're told that God is broken with grief. Humanity is ruining his good world, and they're ruining each other. And so out of a passion to protect the goodness of his world, he washes it clean of humanity's evil with a great flood. But he protects one blameless human, Noah, and his family, and he commissions him as a new Adam. He repeats the divine blessing and commissions him to go out into the world. And so our hopes are really high, but then Noah fails too, and also in a garden. He goes and he plants a vineyard, and he gets drunk out of his mind. And then one of his sons, Ham, does something shameful to his father in the tent. And so here we have our new Adam, naked and ashamed, just like the first, and the downward spiral begins again. It all leads to the foundation of the city of Babylon. The people of ancient Mesopotamia, they come together around this new technology they have, the brick. And they can make cities and towers bigger and faster than anybody's ever done before. And they want to build a new kind of tower that will reach up to the gods, and they will make a great name for themselves. It's an image of human rebellion and arrogance. It's the garden rebellion now writ large. And so God humbles their pride and scatters them. Now, this is a diverse group of stories, but you can see they're all exploring the same basic point. God keeps giving humans the chance to do the right thing with his world, and humans keep ruining it. These stories are making a claim that we live in a good world that we have turned bad, that we've all chosen to define good and evil for ourselves, and so we all contribute to this world of broken relationships, leading to conflict and violence and ultimately death. But there's hope. God promised that one day a descendant would come, the wounded victor who will defeat evil at its source. And so despite humanity's evil, God is determined to bless and rescue his world. And so the big question, of course, is what is God going to do? And the next story, The Hinge, offers the answer. But for now, that's what Genesis 1 through 11 is all about.
In 7 minutes, I'm sure he missed nothing. It's a very helpful video, I think. So I hope it is helpful for you as well. No, don't play. Don't do it. Okay. I think I did it right. No, don't do that. Go here. This is going to be fine. Unless it starts playing in the background. I'll have to fix it. Okay. So what struck you out of that video? It did.
So if you lived in ancient Bible times, odds are you lived under the authority of a king.
And many of these kings claimed that they were gods.
Good, I saved it. Okay. All right. So as you heard that video, right? Again, let's just say some things off the top of our head. It was 7 minutes. So is it a simplification of Genesis chapters 1 through 11? Yes, it has to be. But what for you stuck out in that video, or something that you are encountering differently in these stories? We can talk about the Tower of Babel here in a second, but we're close to time, a little over. What do you think?
That man sins and God forgives and starts over.
Yes.
God forgives and man
Yeah,
And you see it in Judges.
you do, all the time. All the time. Good. What else?
Cain was the start of the evil in the world, so the descendants of Cain were the people that were pegged on against the ways of God.
That we're mucking it up even worse. Yeah, absolutely.
How did he mark, I mean, I know it wasn't in the movie, but how did he mark Cain? So
Maybe-
that nobody
Yeah, endless speculation on that. No idea. No idea. Okay, other thoughts?
So what did Canaan do that was so bad?
Canaan. So Canaan,
Saw his father naked.
or Ham?
Ham,
Yeah,
Ham, the-
sorry.
Yeah, but we'll
head of the Canaan.
yeah we'll stop there
And
for a
then
second
told
because
his brothers.
well I want to come back to your maybe no, it's not a Freudian slip, but Canaan is a person and a place.
Yeah.
So let's not get that confused. And Canaan, right, is the land between. It is the land that will be given to Abraham as a blessing. It is the promised land.
It's Israel.
Yeah. So that's where they'll end up, and it is a descendant of Ham. And it doesn't quite say what he did. There's a I think if I remember correctly, there's a story about him being naked, and Ham either covers his father's nakedness.
No, last
No,
time.
Or he-
tells his brothers and Shem and Japheth cover him.
So that's all it says. I mean, yeah, I don't know. It's unclear. There are these moments, we discover this in Ruth, right, with the sandal. Do you remember the sandal story in Ruth? Where it's like you got to take your sandal and that's how you make like the promise. And it's like, what does that mean? I don't know. No one knows. Same thing with this. There's bits and pieces of our scripture that we have lost. I don't mean that it's gone. It's just the meaning and function behind it has been lost in antiquity. I'm sure, 8,000 years ago, they knew what happened. But apparently it wasn't vital to the telling of the story. Okay, I'll end on some words here about Babel. Babel, for those of you who don't know the story, right, is a big tower, also called a ziggurat, or a temple complex that man is trying to make to reach to the heavens. I don't put a whole lot of stock in this, but I wouldn't be a good person if I didn't say it, that the Tower of Babel has been found. You can look it up. There is a stele or stella, depending on your pronunciation, S-T-E-L-E, of Babylon, of King Nebuchadnezzar II, and the building of the Tower of Babel, all 7 levels, and kind of inscriptions talking about it. And then archaeologists will go to these large mounds and say, this is clearly where it was. And I end up sort of shrugging my shoulders saying, clearly, like this is clearly where the garden is, or this is clearly where the ark came to a rest, or this is clearly where Jericho is. Like, I understand. I think that it is clear to them. I'm not sure it's clear to everybody. But I do think the Tower of Babel, this story, is real. And I think that Babel and Babylon are of strong narrative function in the text. They normally stand in opposition to God. And they will for many other books of the Bible as well. So I'll let you make your own conclusions about that. There's some fascinating dialogue in there about God talking to God's self, saying that we should go down. What does God say in chapters 11?
Let us go down and confuse.
Let us go down. Yeah,
Yes.
beautiful there. Okay. Doing okay?
Yeah.
All right, next week we will take a look at the first part of Abraham's life. We will cover... I didn't write it down. We will cover a large section of Abraham's life, not all of it. We're going to spend 2 weeks talking about Abraham. So if you want to read ahead, you can pick up on chapter 12 and read in for a while. Probably 10 chapters or so will get you going. If you have other questions about Genesis 6 through 11, please let me know, and I'll do our best. Is that what I'd said? Look at me planning ahead. I just didn't write it down. If only I would have remembered my own plan. That's great.
She was a school teacher.
Yeah. Well, I hope this has been helpful and illuminating, and I hope that, again, we are not going to answer every question that we have. We just don't have the time and space. And I hope for you what it does is either scratch an itch or opens up an opportunity for you to engage the text differently at maybe something that you hadn't thought of before. So I encourage you, if there's a story that you're like, he didn't really answer that question, please go home and look it up, and maybe you'll see why I didn't answer the question. And then come back and say, well, this is what I read last week, and it's really interesting, and we would love to hear it. I mean that. So please, if there's something that's sort of bothering you, take that as an opportunity to look it up and share with us what you're discovering. Sound good? All right, let me offer a word of prayer for us. And look, the rain has ceased. Nope, it's still raining. It's okay. We'll be all right. Holy God, thank you for these amazing stories, the beauty in them and the power that they have to inform our lives. So we give you thanks for how you've revealed yourself to us through Scripture. Pray that you'd bring us rest this evening. May we get home safe until we meet again. We pray this all in your Son's name. Amen.